Hi again. So I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about CSS variables and this movement that's coming out of like most of the browser vendors and the adoption of let's start over. So CSS variables, if you didn't know, is an attempt from our good friends at Google, Mozilla, Apple, and everybody, and of course the standards committee, to create a way for you to declare like variables in CSS in essence. And how it works is that you do a dash dash name colon the value, and then you use a variable function to it's holding a reference to the uncompiled version of that value. So if you have a dash dash red colon color red whatever, the parser isn't going to convert that into the word red until you call the var function, which is that's what's then you get the value. So I think it's like overall I think it's a great idea to like take the ideas that you have in like Sass and Less and even in Post CSS these days and put them into the standards, because you've heard me before saying that I want typing in JavaScript and I want it to be the standard, and I don't care exactly which one we do. I just want it to be something fairly well working. TypeScript is pretty good at that, and put it into the standard, because right now we're in this situation where everybody's doing their own thing and nobody really knows what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. And that makes me one of those people who I'm cautious. I'm not I keep up to date with everything as much as I can with everything that is bleeding edge, but I'm not an early adopter. And I'm not an early adopter because I firmly believe that there is a process that should happen where you're trying things out yourself with like smaller projects, and you try stuff out, and then you get to a certain level. It doesn't have to be like Java or .NET mature, but a certain maturity level where you feel that, yeah, this has been proven to have like solved these problems and it's valuable to me in my workflow. But what has that have to do with CSS variables? So the thing that I see as a limitation here is that when you're using something like Sass, for example, and I'm gonna be honest and say a lot of people I think are using too much of the stuff that Sass does. I mean, I've seen a lot of people make CSS so much more complicated than it has to be, or Sass in this situation, where like my rule of thumb is that you use mixins for media queries, you use variable declarations in Sass, and you use the ability to import files so that you can get a nice single compilation, and that's it. That there shouldn't be anything more going on there, in my opinion. And the problem is that I've heard some people talk about, oh well, now that we have CSS variables in the native browser support, we don't really need Sass anymore, and I kind of disagree. And the reason why I disagree is that even though this is true, like the biggest, most valuable thing is variables. That's, in my opinion, why Sass and Less and Post CSS are like that's the original, the genesis, if you will, of how the solution that they originally really solved. And as we went along, they started to do all kinds of other weird stuff that I think was bad, but that was a really good solution. The problem is that there's a lot of tools and like linters and all kinds of other good stuff, and let's not forget the ability to like create a compiled setup of different CSS. You don't have to have it all in one file, so you can import things, all that stuff. You can do that in native as well, but it's not like I don't know if the tools and like the IDEs and the text editors and all that are all that up to date with CSS variables, so that you can get this nice like development experience and the benefit. Because the true challenge, in my opinion, with CSS is like this variable things. This is a convenience, because trust me, most of the time you're not going to, that's not going to be something, this is not going to solve your problems with CSS over time. I honestly think that the most common CSS variable is, okay, color, font, maybe a bit of padding or margins, and that's pretty much it. And the true challenge of getting a big CSS project going in the right direction is, in my opinion, just cleanliness and like specificity, these types of things. That usually you find yourself in a situation where somebody has been over specific with the naming and the stuff that they're doing, and all of a sudden you have to create your own rules to override their rules, and that, and then everything goes to mush from there. So variables is a great movement in like solving what I call a very small problem, because it is a very small problem. I mean, we think ourselves structured and organized enough to always use a variable. And trust me, I've been on projects where like we'd all sat down, really official, big meeting. Everybody said we're gonna use variables to declare our space, the spacing and the padding and that stuff. And 2 years down the road, or 6 months or whatever, I see people forget it. And that's also why I think linters are really important, especially if you need, you make custom linters that, enforce your rule set that you as a team have decided on. So linters, tooting that horn again, linters are amazing. Put some real effort. If you're on a really big project, especially if you're an architect or something, if you're going to make decisions for an entire project, go really deep into linters, like really deep. I think your job should be, if you're not doing that today, and I'm talking to people here who are probably even more experienced than I am, I highly recommend that you put some real effort into thinking about, okay, these are the practices that I want to enforce for my coders. Let's build a set of, if you can't download them, or if they're not already exist, they don't really exist, build them yourself. Put that time in, because nothing is going to keep your project more clean than having linters in every IDE and on every machine that every one of your coders are working on. Sorry, digressing. So the point I'm trying to get to here is that CSS variables is a great thing, but I think that we should stay in compiled land for CSS. And the reason, because, and to me, this is like, some people are thinking that, okay, these variables, and like we're seeing a lot of things coming into like the native parsing, and they're focusing a lot on the idea that once you hit the browser, you have a very nice, that the native platform is supporting a lot of this stuff. But I think that the true strength, I would like to think that the true challenge, or the true thing that is going to be most important for us in the front-end community going forward, is to have a look at what we can do at compile time with CSS. So imagine that you had right now, SAS is fairly bad at producing effective CSS. And this is just a concept, but I've talked to my colleague about it, and I don't think I'm clever enough to do this on my own, but we discussed the idea where if you could, if the compiler that you're using could basically take in, if you can express to the compiler that I want these classes and these properties on an element, instead of having like a class-based system where you're saying that this class should go there and this class should go there, you want to be able to express what styling properties you want to be able to be on a specific element. That's what you're doing with inline today. There's a lot of really cool projects. We haven't solved this problem just yet, but we're talking about going back to old school where we inline all our styles and all that stuff. People have realized that, hey, we can't do that, but maybe we can put our style declarations inside of React components or Angular components in the JavaScript, right? And then run it through a compiler that spits out a CSS file with everything that's specific to to that specific component. And I think there's a little bit of genius there. And it's not just because it's going to like make things like really centralized and really encapsulated in, if you use my personal favorite way of structuring directories. But the true strength, I think, and the true genius in that is that if we get that working and it becomes like a really accepted standard and people really like that way of working, since we now have a hook into a programming language and we're not talking in terms of classes anymore or like labels that represent a set of styles, we can start thinking about just styling properties. Then we can let the compilers optimize our entire style sheet. Just think about it. So if you have just expressed that I want my component to have a color of red, these fonts and so forth, and you can even do inheritance like in this, like in an actual programming language just as JavaScript, then the compiler can optimize your CSS for you. If you have class names and all that stuff, it's on you to make sure that you're not duplicating yourself, and this always happens. Like that CSS always grows. It's always messy. I've never seen it clean, at least not for something a serious project. So what I'm trying to capture here is that there is a lot of power in having things as an inline thing and not like CSS variables is it's a good idea for certain things, but I don't think that's the way we should move as a community. I think we should focus on trying to stay having JavaScript or at least a CSS compiler that takes in the things almost as an inline in an inline way, and then allow that like CSS modules does something like that, where you're basically declaring a CSS class and the module and the CSS modules in from post CSS and so forth takes care of like namespacing it for you, and like it makes basically BEM fairly redundant if you're using that. I still like BEM though, so wouldn't talk bad about BEM. But I think that's the way to go, and I would be really excited to see somebody start an initiative and talk about, okay, we know that CSS is really messy over time, so I'll create an API for you developers to consume, where you just tell me how you want your components to be styled, and I can promise you that my compiler will write the most efficient, most reduced, compressed CSS that it can do, because I know that it's very difficult for you to do that yourself, and I think that it's possible to make something like that, and some people are probably already working on it. But yeah, that's my opinion anyway. I think it's great to see that the standards committee are looking into variables and catching up to everybody else. But I don't think that the idea that we're ever going to get to a point where CSS as it is today is a nice experience, because it's not. It's always been a really it's done its job, and I highly suggest that we as a community start thinking about going in another direction. And I already see a few projects like Aphrodite and so forth trying to figure out a way where, because CSS is it's an unnecessary abstraction. I think it was a bad idea to begin with, because the original idea it's grown so much since what it originally is doing, and right now we're waiting for people to add grid systems and all this stuff, which is really, it's really just a patch on a fundamental problem, and that is the same problem I've argued 100 times is the problem with Dreamweaver, and sometimes with Ruby as well. You create too many abstractions on top of what's actually happening, so you're limiting the development of new features and so forth, because you have too many abstractions. People simply don't have access to what they need in order to do what they want. And my rule of thumb is that if you're providing me a service or an API where I am supposed to be able to be in control, and I should have the freedom to do what I want, then you should interfere as little as possible, because you don't know what I'm trying to build. and that's the problem with CSS. You don't have access to the GPU. You don't have access to like these really low level things that for the most part you really need. And some people say, well, that's a good thing, and I say it is a good thing because in a way because it keeps me from killing myself. But I want to believe that even if you look around, there are people who are really good at this stuff, and they usually create really nice libraries that help us less gifted programmers, not kill ourselves. So that's my little rant about this movement anyway. Hope you have a great day.